Lieutenant Virgil Larry, who had led the first group to safety, devoted significant portions of his post-war life to ensuring the massacre remained in public memory, frequently speaking at veterans gatherings and historical commemorations. The experience had transformed him from a technical officer into an unwilling witness to history, a role he accepted with solemn dedication despite the personal toll of repeatedly revisiting his trauma. "I survived by chance," Larry often said during these presentations. "I lived because someone else's body shielded mine. That creates an obligation to speak for those who cannot." In 1965, on the 21st anniversary of the massacre, Larry returned to the Malmedy crossroads for the first time since 1944. Standing at the memorial that had been erected there, surrounded by Belgian citizens and a handful of fellow survivors, he found himself unable to speak when called upon to address the gathering. After several moments of silence, he simply said, "They were good men. They deserve better than this field." The simplicity of his statement captured the essential tragedy more effectively than any elaborate speech could have. Private James Matera, whose shoulder wound had never fully healed and left him with permanent limited mobility in his left arm, became a high school history teacher in Massachusetts. Each December, he devoted a class period to discussing the Malmedy massacre, using it to explore not just historical facts, but deeper questions about human behavior during wartime and the fragility of civilized restraint under extreme conditions. "What happened at Malmedy wasn't unique," he would tell his students. "It was just better documented than most atrocities because there were American survivors who lived to testify. For every documented war crime, dozens went unrecorded. The lesson isn't just about what the Germans did. It's about what humans are capable of when they dehumanize their enemies and abandon moral principles." The Belgian community near Malmedy embraced this obligation as well. In 1945, they erected a stone memorial at the massacre site, which still stands today. Every December 17th, local citizens join with veterans and their families to commemorate the tragedy, laying wreaths and maintaining a solemn vigil regardless of weather conditions. The memorial bears a simple inscription in both French and English. Here, on December 17, 1944, 150 American prisoners of war were assembled in this field. 84 were murdered by German SS troops. The discrepancy in numbers reflects the initial uncertainty about exactly how many Americans were present and killed. On the frigid afternoon of December 17 of 1944, when snow blanketed the Ardennes forest and gun smoke hung like shrouds between the pines, 84 American prisoners of war stood shivering in a frozen Belgian field as Waffen-SS Obersturmführer Werner Sternebeck raised his Walther P38 pistol. The metal gleamed dully in the winter light as frost formed on the officer's leather gloves. Lieutenant Virgil Larry, 22 years old and barely 3 months into European combat, watched helplessly as the first shots cracked the winter stillness, the sound echoing like splitting ice across the killing field. Bodies collapsed into crimson-stained snow, while surviving soldiers pressed themselves into frozen earth, playing dead beneath their fallen comrades as German machine guns methodically swept the field, their mechanical chattering punctuated by the screams of the dying and the hollow thump of bullets finding human targets. This was the most ruthless field execution American forces had encountered on the Western Front, a calculated atrocity that would come to define the savagery of the Battle of the Bulge. This is the story of how battlefield surrender became a death sentence, and how a handful of bloodied, half-frozen survivors, their uniforms stiffened with ice and the blood of their friends, ensured the world would never forget the Malmedy massacre. Subscribe now to discover what the United States Army found when they finally recaptured that blood-soaked Belgian crossroads where frozen corpses remained in their final poses for weeks, hands still raised in the universal gesture of surrender that their killers had chosen to ignore. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944 began under a slate-gray sky that pressed down like a coffin lid over the snow-covered forest straddling Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The air carried a brittle quality that burned the lungs with each breath, promising more snow as darkness gathered earlier each day. American forces, stretched thin across an 85-mile front, had considered this densely wooded sector a quiet zone where green divisions could gain experience and battle-weary units could recuperate. Most commanders believed the thick forest, limited roads, and approaching winter made their region unsuitable for major military operations. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. Hitler had assembled a massive strike force in absolute secrecy, 25 divisions, including elite Waffen-SS panzer units, with over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks waited in the forest shadows. Their objective was ambitious: split the Allied forces with a lightning thrust through the Ardennes, recapture Antwerp, and shatter the fragile Allied coalition. The operation received the code name Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, as a deception, suggesting a defensive rather than offensive posture. The German preparations had been meticulous. Artillery units pre-registered targets using maps rather than ranging shots that might alert the Americans. Tanks and vehicles were muffled with cloth to dampen engine noise. Troops moved exclusively at night, hiding under pine boughs during daylight hours. Radio silence was strictly enforced, with orders transmitted by courier. For weeks, German soldiers had watched American positions through binoculars, noting patrol patterns, guard rotations, and vulnerable points in the thinly held line. Among the German forces was the Kampfgruppe Peiper, a powerful armored battle group led by Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a fanatically loyal 30-year-old SS officer with a reputation for both tactical brilliance and merciless efficiency. His command included the most experienced elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's former bodyguard unit that had evolved into one of the most feared fighting forces on the Eastern Front. Peiper's men had become hardened through years of brutal combat against Soviet forces, where the war had deteriorated into a savage struggle with few prisoners and fewer rules. Peiper's battle group comprised over 4,000 men and approximately 120 tanks and armored vehicles. His force included the newest King Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could penetrate any Allied armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The column stretched for miles when fully deployed, a steel serpent designed to strike deep into Allied territory before resistance could solidify. They represented the tip of the German offensive spear, assigned the critical task of capturing bridges over the Meuse River before Allied forces could react. The mission depended entirely on speed. Any delay meant certain failure, as Allied air power and reinforcements would inevitably overwhelm the German advance. Hitler had personally emphasized this point to his commanders. This offensive is to decide whether we shall live or die. You must hurry. The night before the attack, Peiper had gathered his officers in a school requisitioned as a temporary headquarters. Maps covered the tables, illuminated by paraffin lamps that cast elongated shadows across the room. Cigarette smoke formed a blue haze near the ceiling as Peiper traced their route with a wooden pointer. "We must reach the Meuse in 24 hours, he told them, his voice calm but insistent. "Nothing must slow us down. Not terrain, not weather, not the enemy, and certainly not prisoners. Is that understood?" The officers nodded. Most had served under Peiper for years and understood the implications. Prisoners represented a burden they could not afford, a drain on time, manpower, and supplies that would jeopardize their primary mission. The attack began at 5:30 on the morning of December 16, when more than 1,900 German artillery pieces opened fire along the entire front. The bombardment shattered the pre-dawn darkness, turning the forest into a hellscape of splintered trees, churned earth, and shrapnel-filled air. Through this maelstrom came the German infantry, advancing in white snow camouflage that rendered them nearly invisible against the winter landscape. Behind them rolled the tanks and assault guns, crushing fallen trees and widening forest paths into roads suitable for heavy vehicles. American units, caught completely by surprise, responded with confusion and often heroic resistance. But the German numerical advantage proved overwhelming in sector after sector. By nightfall, Kampfgruppe Peiper had punched through the initial American defensive positions and was driving westward at maximum speed. Fuel consumption became Peiper's primary concern. His heavy vehicles devoured gasoline at alarming rates, especially when traveling up the steep, winding Ardennes roads. On the morning of December 17, Peiper received intelligence that an American fuel depot had been captured near Billingen. He immediately diverted his column, acquiring over 50,000 gallons of captured gasoline before resuming his advance. With fuel tanks replenished, the battle group drove westward with renewed urgency, crushing sporadic resistance and bypassing stronger positions, rather than becoming bogged down in prolonged engagements. By early afternoon, his advance elements were approaching the critical crossroads near Malmedy. Battery B of the United States Army's 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion had no inkling of the gathering storm. The unit consisted primarily of young men trained to locate enemy artillery through sound and flash ranging techniques. Most were technical specialists rather than combat infantrymen, though all had received basic combat training. Their convoy of approximately 30 vehicles was moving toward Ligneuville, Belgium, on the morning of December 17, carrying about 130 men through the freezing mist. The convoy had departed from their position near Saint-Vith shortly after breakfast, following orders to relocate to a new observation post. Their trucks and jeeps were loaded with delicate sound-ranging equipment, radio gear, and the personal belongings of men who expected to establish a semi-permanent installation. Some vehicles carried holiday packages from home. Christmas was just over a week away, and many had received presents they had yet to open. A few men had tucked small decorated pine branches into their vehicles, improvised Christmas trees that brought a touch of festivity to their wartime existence. Lieutenant Virgil Larry had joined the unit in September after graduating from officer candidate school. At 22 years old, with curly brown hair and a steady demeanor, he had quickly earned the respect of his men through quiet competence rather than bombastic authority. That morning he rode in a jeep near the front of the convoy, scanning the foggy forest with growing unease. Reports of German activity had been filtering in since dawn, but details remained vague and contradictory. "Something feels off," Larry remarked to his driver, Private First Class James Matera, a wiry 19-year-old from Boston with quick reflexes and an even quicker wit. "We should have seen more traffic on this road." "Maybe everyone else got the memo to stay inside where it's warm," Matera replied, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and occasional snowflakes drifted through the mist that clung to the dark pine trees. Larry unfolded his map, tracing their route with a gloved finger. They were approximately 6 miles from their destination, traveling along a narrow road that wound through heavily forested terrain. The map showed few alternative routes. If they encountered trouble, their options for detour would be limited. In the second Jeep, Technical Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens was having similar thoughts. A career soldier with 7 years of service before the war, Ahrens had developed the sixth sense that experienced combat veterans often acquire, an intuitive awareness of danger that operates below conscious thought. As they passed a small clearing, he noticed something that triggered this internal alarm: fresh track marks in the snow, wide and deep, consistent with heavy vehicles moving at speed. "Those aren't ours," he muttered to his driver. "Too wide for our trucks." The driver nodded grimly. "Tanks?" "Maybe," radioed the lieutenant. But before Ahrens could alert Larry, the convoy rounded a bend and found itself approaching the fateful crossroads near the hamlet of Bonnier. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the convoy approached a key crossroads near the hamlet of Bonnier, approximately 2.5 miles southeast of Malmedy. The visibility had improved slightly, with patches of pale winter sunlight occasionally breaking through the overcast sky. The lead vehicles slowed as they neared the intersection, standard procedure in potentially contested territory. As the first Jeep reached the crossroads, Private Matera suddenly stamped on the brakes, causing the vehicle to skid slightly on the icy road surface. Lieutenant Larry was thrown forward against his seatbelt, his question dying on his lips as he saw what had caused their sudden stop. Through breaks in the fog approximately 400 yards ahead, they could see German armor approaching from the east, the advance elements of Kampfgruppe Piper. Even at that distance, the distinctive silhouettes of Panther tanks were unmistakable, their long-barreled 75mm guns swiveling ominously toward the American convoy. Behind the Panthers came half-tracks filled with SS infantry, their coal scuttle helmets and winter camouflage giving them an otherworldly appearance through the shifting mist. For several heartbeats, both forces seemed frozen in mutual surprise. Then the spell broke as a German officer standing in a half-track raised his arm and pointed directly at the American column. "Turn around!" came the shouted order, passed from vehicle to vehicle down the line. Drivers frantically attempted to reverse course on the narrow road, but German tanks were already opening fire. The first shell screamed over the convoy, exploding in the trees beyond. The second found its mark, striking a 6x6 truck loaded with radio equipment. The vehicle erupted in flames, blocking the road and trapping the vehicles behind it. Within minutes, the situation deteriorated into chaos as armor-piercing shells tore through unprotected vehicles. Men abandoned their jeeps and trucks, seeking shelter in ditches and behind the scant cover of roadside trees. Small arms fire erupted as Americans returned fire with rifles and the few machine guns they had mounted on vehicles, but their bullets merely sparked off the German armor like angry fireflies. Lieutenant Larry found himself pinned down with a group of approximately 20 soldiers behind an embankment. His service pistol felt absurdly inadequate against the German tanks, which were now methodically advancing through the scattered American vehicles, crushing some beneath their treads, while setting others ablaze with machine gun fire. "We need to get to the woods," Larry shouted over the cacophony of battle. "Spread out. 5-yard intervals, go." Several men made it to the tree line, but others fell as German machine guns swept the open ground. Larry dragged a wounded soldier into a shallow depression, noting with clinical detachment that his own hands were already stained with frozen blood. Whether his own or someone else's, he couldn't tell, as white phosphorus shells began exploding nearby, filling the air with choking smoke that burned the skin on contact. Larry made the difficult decision that would haunt him forever. The Germans were too many, too well armed. Continued resistance meant certain death for all his remaining men. "We have to surrender," he told his men, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Remove your helmets, raise your hands, and move slowly." Similar scenes played out across the battlefield as the hopelessly outgunned Americans realized the futility of resistance. In small groups, they emerged from cover with raised hands. The Germans quickly disarmed them, confiscating watches, cigarettes, and other valuables, before herding the prisoners into a field beside the crossroads. There they joined other captured Americans, until approximately 84 prisoners stood shivering in the snow. The disarmament process was conducted with methodical efficiency, but increasing roughness, as German soldiers discovered valuable items among the American equipment. One SS sergeant with a pockmarked face seemed particularly interested in wristwatches, collecting at least a dozen from the prisoners while cursing at them in guttural German. Another confiscated cigarettes, stuffing American Camels and Lucky Strikes into his pockets with obvious satisfaction. A tall, thin SS man with wire-rimmed glasses carefully examined the Americans' identification tags, occasionally asking questions in surprisingly good English. "You," he said, pointing to a soldier with sergeant's stripes. "What unit?" 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, the man replied. The German made a note in a small book. "Purpose of your movement?" "I can only give name, rank, and serial number," the sergeant answered, his voice firm despite the visible trembling of his hands in the bitter cold. The German shrugged. "It does not matter. We know already." Whether this was true or a bluff was impossible to determine. The prisoners huddled together against the biting cold, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Many wore only standard-issue wool uniforms without winter coats, having abandoned their vehicles so quickly they had no chance to retrieve additional clothing. They stamped their feet against the cold as they waited, uncertain of their fate but clinging to the protections guaranteed to prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Lieutenant Larry used the waiting time to assess their situation. The field was approximately 100 yards square, bordered by forest on two sides and the road on the third. German tanks and half-tracks formed the fourth boundary. With SS soldiers standing guard at roughly 10-yard intervals around the perimeter, Larry estimated at least 30 guards, all heavily armed. Escape seemed impossible, especially for men weakened by cold and the shock of recent combat. Instead, Larry focused on boosting morale, moving quietly among his men with whispered reassurances. "Standard procedure," he told them. "They'll process us, then move us to a collection point. We'll be out of this cold soon." He wasn't certain he believed this himself, but the words seemed to calm some of the younger soldiers. Meanwhile, the German forces around the crossroads were reorganizing. Most of Kampfgruppe Peiper's vehicles continued westward without stopping, clearly prioritizing their advance over dealing with prisoners. Only a small detachment remained at the crossroads, perhaps 50 men with several vehicles, including a Panther tank and two half-tracks. Obersturmführer Werner Sternebeck, commanding the German vehicles at the crossroads, appeared irritated by the delay the prisoners represented. A compact man with a sharply defined widow's peak and cold blue eyes, Sternebeck had been with the SS since 1937 and had served on both Eastern and Western fronts. His left cheek bore a puckered scar from shrapnel received during street fighting in Kharkov, and his demeanor suggested a man accustomed to making difficult decisions quickly. Kampfgruppe Peiper's mission depended entirely on maintaining momentum. Every minute spent processing prisoners was a minute lost in the race to the Meuse. Sternebeck paced near his command half-track, occasionally glancing at his watch and speaking tersely into a radio handset. The advancing column was already several kilometers ahead, and the gap was widening. He conferred briefly with several officers, their conversation inaudible to the Americans standing in the field. The discussion appeared increasingly heated. One officer gestured emphatically toward the prisoners, shaking his head. Sternebeck responded with a sharp, cutting motion of his hand that silenced further debate. The other officers stiffened to attention, then moved away to carry out whatever orders they had received. American sergeants among the prisoners had been watching this exchange with increasing concern. Technical Sergeant Ahrens edged closer to Lieutenant Larry. "Something's wrong, sir," he whispered. "They're not setting up for transport." Larry had noticed the same thing. Standard procedure for processing prisoners involved organizing them into manageable groups, recording basic information, and arranging transport to rear areas. None of this was happening. Instead, the Germans seemed to be reinforcing the perimeter around the field while reducing the number of personnel interacting directly with the prisoners. "Keep calm," Larry told Ahrens. "I don't give them any excuse." What happened next remains one of the most notorious war crimes committed against American forces during World War II. According to survivor accounts, Sternebeck approached the gathered prisoners, drew his Walther P-38 pistol, and without warning fired 2 shots into the crowd. This apparent signal unleashed a coordinated barrage as German soldiers opened fire with machine guns, rifles, and pistols. The first volley cut down dozens of men. Bodies collapsed into the blood-stained snow as panic erupted among the survivors. Some attempted to flee despite knowing the futility of running across an open field. Others instinctively dropped to the ground, whether wounded or simulating death in a desperate gambit for survival. Lieutenant Larry felt a bullet graze his right arm just before he dove to the ground. The impact spun him halfway around, and he landed awkwardly, partially beneath the body of a dead comrade, whose blood quickly soaked into Larry's uniform. The coppery smell of it filled his nostrils as he pressed his face into the snow, fighting the instinctive urge to move, to run, to do anything but lie motionless in the growing field of carnage. The firing continued for what seemed an eternity, but was probably less than 2 minutes. The disciplined, synchronized volleys gave way to scattered individual shots as German soldiers targeted anyone showing signs of movement. Machine gun fire raked across the field in methodical sweeps, the bullets making a peculiar whipping sound as they passed inches above those lying prone. Larry remained motionless, scarcely breathing, as German soldiers walked among the fallen Americans, delivering coup de grace shots to anyone showing signs of life. He could hear boots crunching in the snow, coming closer, stopping, the sound of a single pistol shot, then moving on to the next victim. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Footsteps, pause, shot, footsteps. I could feel the vibration through the ground each time they fired, Larry would later testify. I heard the sounds of men praying, crying for their mothers, begging for mercy. Then individual shots as those voices went silent. Next to Larry, a young private whimpered softly, blood bubbling from a chest wound with each labored breath. His eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Larry's. The lieutenant placed a finger to his lips in a desperate plea for silence, knowing that any sound would bring the executioners. The private bit his lower lip so hard it bled, but managed to stifle his cries as tears froze on his cheeks. Private First Class Homer Ford lay nearby, playing dead despite a bullet wound in his foot. He later recalled watching through barely opened eyes as a German soldier systematically moved from body to body, firing his pistol at point-blank range into the heads of wounded Americans. The SS man seemed neither rushed nor emotional. He might have been performing routine maintenance on a vehicle for all the feeling he displayed. When his pistol emptied, he calmly reloaded, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, before continuing his grim task. Another survivor, Sergeant William Summers, described hearing German soldiers laughing as they examined the bodies, occasionally taking personal items from the dead. One SS man collected American cigarettes from breast pockets, while another seemed particularly interested in finding good boots, as his own were visibly worn. The massacre lasted approximately 15 minutes. When it concluded, the German forces remounted their vehicles and continued their advance toward Ligneville, leaving behind what they presumed were 84 dead Americans in the blood-spattered field. But not all were dead. Miraculously, despite grievous wounds and the execution-style killings, approximately 40 Americans had survived the initial massacre by playing dead or being shielded by the bodies of their comrades. As engine sounds faded into the distance, these men remained motionless, fearing the Germans might have left sentries behind. The field fell into an eerie silence broken only by the occasional moan of the wounded or the whisper of wind through the nearby pines. Snow began falling again, gentle flakes landing on the dead and living alike, gradually covering the dark stains that spread across the field. The temperature continued dropping as afternoon waned toward evening. For the survivors, a new kind of torture began. Those unwounded faced the psychological trauma of lying among the dead, unable to move, speak, or assist their injured comrades. Those with wounds experienced the additional agony of suppressing cries of pain while blood froze in their clothing and hypothermia set in. Several men who had initially survived their wounds died during this period of enforced stillness, their bodies growing cold beside comrades who dared not acknowledge their passing. After nearly an hour of absolute stillness, several unwounded survivors began whispering to each other. The immediate threat appeared to have passed, but a new danger was becoming apparent. The temperature was dropping rapidly as daylight waned, and they realized that remaining in the open field meant certain death from exposure for the wounded. "We have to move," whispered Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens to those nearest him. "Anyone who can walk needs to try for the woods before dark." Lieutenant Larry, his right sleeve stiff with frozen blood, carefully raised his head and surveyed the field. The scene was apocalyptic. Dozens of bodies lay in unnatural positions across the snow, which had turned a deep crimson in many places. Some of the dead had their hands still raised in futile gestures of surrender. Others were curled into fetal positions, their final moments spent trying to protect themselves from bullets that offered no mercy. The faces of the dead haunted Larry most. Young men with expressions frozen in shock, surprise, or terror. Boys from farms in Iowa and street corners in Brooklyn, united in death on a remote Belgian crossroads thousands of miles from home. He recognized most of them, men he had trained with, eaten with, joked with. Men whose families would soon receive telegrams beginning with the words, "We regret to inform you." Carefully, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid attracting attention from any potential German observers, Larry began crawling toward a wooded area approximately 100 yards away. Each movement sent waves of pain through his injured arm, and the frozen ground scraped against his chest like sandpaper. Several others followed his example, forming a macabre procession of men crawling between corpses, leaving faint trails in the new-fallen snow. The journey took nearly 45 minutes of painful progress through snow stained with the blood of their comrades. One man, Private Samuel Jenkins, was halfway to the trees when the sound of approaching vehicles froze them all in place. Through the gathering darkness, they could see the headlights of several German vehicles returning to the crossroads. Hearts pounding, the crawling men pressed themselves flat, praying the deepening dusk and falling snow would hide their movement tracks. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the field. Flashlight beams played across the bodies as German soldiers conducted a quick inspection. They seemed primarily interested in confirming that no one had removed the American dead rather than checking for survivors. After perhaps 10 minutes, the vehicles departed again, leaving the field to its dead and the hidden living. Upon reaching the relative safety of the trees, Larry and 11 others regrouped. They were in desperate condition, thinly clothed in the deepening winter cold, several nursing wounds, all in various stages of shock. Their situation seemed nearly hopeless, trapped behind enemy lines as the German offensive continued to gain momentum around them. "We need to split up," Larry decided after assessing their situation. "Small groups have a better chance of slipping through. Head southwest if possible. That's where our lines should be." Before separating, they made a pact. Whoever survived would tell the world what had happened at the crossroads. This wasn't merely a battlefield tragedy, but a deliberate war crime that demanded justice. They shared the few supplies they had: a partial canteen of water, some crackers from a K-ration, a single morphine syringe that went to the most severely wounded man. Then, with whispered good wishes, they divided into 3 groups and disappeared into the darkening forest. While these 12 made their escape attempt, other survivors remained hidden among the dead, too wounded to move or too terrified to risk being seen. As darkness fell completely, temperatures plummeted below freezing. For these men, a new struggle began, surviving the lethal cold with inadequate clothing and often serious wounds. Private James Matera had been shot through the shoulder, but had avoided the coup de grace by convincing himself to remain absolutely motionless, even as a German soldier kicked his seemingly lifeless body. The soldier had laughed, said something in German to a companion, and moved on. As night fell and the field grew silent, Matera realized he would freeze to death without shelter. His left arm was useless, and each breath sent shards of pain through his chest where he suspected the bullet had cracked a rib before exiting. Blood had frozen his uniform to his skin, and his extremities were growing dangerously numb. Hypothermia was setting in. He recognized the symptoms from winter training, the confusion and paradoxical feeling of warmth that preceded freezing to death. Matera forced himself to think clearly. He had glimpsed a farmhouse about a quarter-mile east of the crossroads during the initial firefight. If he could reach it, perhaps the occupants would help. It was a desperate gamble. The house might be occupied by Germans, or the Belgian family might turn him away rather than risk reprisals for harboring an American. Despite excruciating pain, he began dragging himself toward where he thought the farmhouse should be. The journey of less than a quarter mile took him over 4 hours of agonizing effort, leaving a trail of blood in the snow behind him. Twice he stopped, convinced he could go no further, ready to surrender to the seductive drowsiness that promised relief from pain. Each time he forced himself to continue by focusing on specific memories: his mother's face, his girlfriend's laugh, the taste of his favorite meal, anchoring himself to life through sensory recollection. The moon emerged briefly from behind clouds, illuminating a small stone farmhouse with a thatched roof approximately 50 yards ahead. A faint light glowed from a heavily curtained window. Matera dragged himself to the door and, gathering his remaining strength, knocked twice before collapsing on the threshold. The door opened a crack, then wider as the farmer saw the wounded American. The Belgian man, perhaps 50 years old, with a deeply lined face that spoke of years working in harsh weather, quickly pulled Matera inside. His wife, a thin woman with graying hair tied back in a severe bun, gasped at the sight, but immediately began gathering clean cloths and a basin of water. Upon reaching the farmhouse, Matera found the Belgian family inside, initially terrified to assist him, knowing that harboring Allied soldiers carried a death sentence under German occupation. The farmer, Henri Lejolie, spoke broken English he had learned during the First World War. "Germans everywhere," he warned, making sweeping gestures with his hands. "Very dangerous for you, very dangerous for us." Nevertheless, basic humanity prevailed. They brought him inside, treated his wound as best they could with homemade poultices and bandages torn from an old sheet, and hid him in their cellar when German patrols passed through the area. The Lejolie family had a teenage son who spoke better English, having learned it in school before the war. Through him, Matera learned that German units had been moving through the area continuously since morning, all heading west in what was clearly a major offensive. "They say they will be in Paris by Christmas," the boy translated his father's words. "They say the war is turning in their favor." Matera, feverish but lucid, shook his head. "They won't make it. Our forces will stop them." Even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. The German attack had caught them completely by surprise, and the massacre at the crossroads suggested an enemy operating with brutal confidence. For 3 days, Matera remained hidden in the Lejolie farmhouse, spending most of his time in the dirt-floored cellar when German vehicles passed nearby, which happened frequently. The wound in his shoulder became infected, despite Madame Lejolie's careful ministrations with boiled water and what few medical supplies they possessed. By the 3rd night, he was delirious with fever, alternating between chills that made his teeth chatter uncontrollably and burning heat that left his clothing soaked with sweat. On the fourth morning, Monsieur Le Joly made a dangerous decision. He would try to find Allied medical help. German units had thinned out in their immediate area as the advance pushed farther west, and rumors suggested American forces were counterattacking from the south. Taking his ancient bicycle, Le Joly pedaled through back roads and forest paths, eventually locating an American reconnaissance unit from the 26th Infantry Division. "American soldier, wounded, my house," he told them in his limited English, gesturing emphatically. "Germans kill many at Crossroad. This one, escape." The American patrol, commanded by a Lieutenant Wilson, followed Le Joly back to the farmhouse. They found Matera barely conscious, his wound now severely infected, his survival hanging by a thread. As medics worked to stabilize him for transport, Matera managed to convey what he had witnessed at the Malmedy crossroads. Wilson immediately recognized the intelligence value of this information and sent a runner back to headquarters with a priority message detailing the apparent massacre of American prisoners. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Larry and 3 others from his group managed to travel approximately 7 miles over the next 24 hours, moving exclusively at night and hiding during daylight. They subsisted on snow melted in their mouths and a few forest edibles one soldier recognized from survival training. Pine needle tea brewed in a dented canteen provided minimal warmth and vitamin C, while frozen rose hips offered scant calories. The cold remained their deadliest enemy. Without proper winter clothing, they were continuously at risk of frostbite and hypothermia. They took turns walking in the rear of their small column, using a pine branch to brush away their footprints in the snow, a precaution that slowed their progress but reduced the chance of German patrols tracking them. On the evening of December 19th, they finally encountered an American reconnaissance patrol from the 30th Infantry Division near the village of Stavlo. The patrol had been sent forward to gather intelligence on German movements and initially challenged the approaching figures with raised rifles, unsure whether they were facing enemy infiltrators. "Flash," called the patrol leader, using the standard challenge. "Thunder," Larry responded correctly, though his voice was so weak from cold and exhaustion that he had to repeat it. The patrol quickly ushered them into a nearby farmhouse that served as a temporary outpost. Inside, the warmth from a wood stove hit them like a physical force, painful on frostbitten extremities, but indescribably welcome. As they gratefully accepted hot coffee and K-rations, the patrol leader, Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell, asked for their identification and unit. Barely able to stand, suffering from frostbite and exposure, Larry's first words to his rescuers were not about his own condition, but about the atrocity he had witnessed. "The Germans murdered our boys in cold blood after they surrendered. At a crossroads near Malmedy, at least 50 men shot after they surrendered." Mitchell immediately radioed this information to his company headquarters, recognizing its significance. Within hours, the report had been relayed up the chain of command to the headquarters of the First Army, where it joined similar accounts from other survivors who had reached American lines. Over the following week, a total of 43 survivors from the Malmedy massacre would eventually reach American lines through various routes. Some had been hidden by Belgian civilians. Others had made their way through German lines alone or in small groups. Several had been so badly wounded they could barely walk, dragging themselves through the snow for miles rather than waiting for death in that blood-soaked field. Each carried with them not only physical wounds, but the psychological trauma of having witnessed such calculated brutality. Their consistent testimonies, provided independently, painted an undeniable picture of deliberate war crime rather than the fog of war incident the Germans would later claim. News of the massacre spread quickly through American forces. The detailed survivor accounts were immediately recognized as intelligence of exceptional value, not merely for their evidence of war crimes, but for what they revealed about German intentions. The calculated brutality suggested this was not a limited counterattack, but a major offensive in which the Germans felt confident enough to disregard the conventions of war. The reaction among ordinary American soldiers was visceral. Many had maintained a certain professional respect for the German Wehrmacht, considering them skilled and generally honorable opponents despite fighting for a reprehensible cause. The Malmedy massacre shattered this perception, particularly regarding Waffen-SS units. Suddenly, surrender became a much less viable option if captured by SS troops. The choice might be between fighting to the death or being executed anyway. First Army headquarters ordered intelligence officers to interview all survivors, compiling detailed accounts that included physical descriptions of German officers present, unit insignia observed, and precise timelines of events. These interviews revealed that most of the German soldiers involved wore the distinctive runic insignia of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division. Several survivors specifically identified Kampfgruppe Piper as the unit responsible, having noted vehicle markings and overhead conversations among their captors. On December 21st, just 4 days after the massacre, the United States First Army Headquarters issued a directive to all units. No SS troops or paratroopers will be taken prisoner, but will be shot on sight. This order, which effectively sanctioned retaliatory war crimes, reflected the incandescent rage that had swept through American forces. Senior commanders recognized the dangerous moral territory this represented and quickly rescinded the order, but not before it had circulated widely among combat units. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, addressed the situation in a memorandum to his senior commanders. "We will not adopt the criminal methods of our enemies. American forces will continue to operate within the recognized rules of warfare, treating prisoners humanely as required by the Geneva Convention. However, all personnel should be informed of the Malmedy incident and advised to exercise extreme caution when dealing with SS units." Despite this official position, unofficial retribution occurred throughout the remaining Battle of the Bulge. While most German prisoners continued to receive proper treatment, captured SS troops, particularly those from the Leibstandarte Division, sometimes faced summary execution. These incidents were rarely documented officially, but post-war interviews with veterans confirmed their occurrence. As one sergeant from the 28th Infantry Division later commented, "After what they did at Malmedy, nobody wanted SS prisoners. They had their chance for civilized warfare and chose butchery instead." The massacre transformed the character of the battle that came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. American resistance stiffened noticeably as word spread. Men who might have surrendered when surrounded now fought to the death, knowing the alternative could be execution. Units that might have withdrawn from untenable positions held their ground with desperate determination. The psychological impact was profound. The massacre had removed surrender as a viable option for many American soldiers. This hardened resistance proved crucial in key engagements throughout the Ardennes campaign. At Bastogne, surrounded elements of the 101st Airborne Division famously replied, "Nuts," to a German surrender demand. At Saint-Vith, combat engineers and support troops transformed into infantry, fought with unexpected tenacity. Along countless forest roads and village streets, American units delayed the German advance just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. For the Germans, any tactical advantage gained through the murder of prisoners proved catastrophically short-sighted. Not only did they face increasingly determined resistance, but Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance ultimately stalled due to fuel shortages, the very delay they had sought to avoid by not properly securing prisoners. Peiper's force was eventually surrounded and destroyed, with only a small percentage of his men escaping back to German lines. As Allied forces recaptured the Malmedy crossroads on January 13 of 1945, they discovered a grim tableau preserved by the winter cold. The victims' bodies, frozen in their final positions, remained where they had fallen nearly a month earlier. Snow had covered them partially, but the dark shapes were clearly visible across the field, some in groups where friends had huddled together in their final moments, others isolated where they had attempted to flee. American graves, registration personnel approached the task with professional solemnity, but many were visibly shaken by what they found. Captain Joseph Martin, who supervised the recovery operation, later wrote in his report, "In 16 months of frontline service, I have witnessed numerous battlefield casualties, but nothing prepared me for the systematic execution evident at Malmedy. This was not combat, it was murder." Army photographers documented the scene meticulously, creating evidence that would later prove crucial in war crimes proceedings. They captured images of bodies still frozen in postures of surrender, of multiple bullet wounds to the head and chest, of victims who had clearly been shot while lying wounded on the ground. These photographs, clinical in their detail but horrifying in their implications, would later be presented as evidence at the Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings against specific SS units. Medical examiners confirmed what survivors had reported. Most victims had been shot multiple times, many showing evidence of coup de grace shots delivered at close range to the head or chest. Several bodies were found, with their hands still raised in positions of surrender. The physical evidence left no doubt about the deliberate nature of the killings. Dr. Edward Larson, a forensic pathologist attached to the U.S. Army Medical Corps, conducted examinations of 32 bodies recovered from the site. His findings, documented in a 50-page report, included details that reinforced the survivors' accounts. Approximately 70% of the examined casualties exhibited gunshot wounds consistent with execution-style killing. Specifically, contact or near-contact wounds to the head or upper chest, he wrote. Multiple victims showed evidence of having been shot while already prone on the ground, as indicated by bullet trajectory paths and snow pattern impressions preserved beneath the bodies. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied authorities began systematically investigating the massacre. The newly established War Crimes Branch of the United States Army devoted significant resources to building a case, interviewing survivors, examining physical evidence, and identifying the responsible German units. Colonel Burton Ellis led the investigation team, which included lawyers, forensic experts, and intelligence officers. They compiled dossiers on suspected participants, cross-referenced unit rosters and movement orders, and traced the chain of command within Kampfgruppe Peiper. Their work was complicated by the chaotic final months of the war, during which many records were destroyed and suspected perpetrators scattered across Europe. Despite these challenges, by July, investigators had traced responsibility to Kampfgruppe Peiper and the 1st SS Panzer Division. American counterintelligence units began systematically arresting former members of this division, particularly officers, and those specifically identified by survivors. Joachim Peiper himself was captured in June 1945 at his home in Bavaria, apparently making no attempt to hide his identity or evade justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple survivor testimonies, forensic examinations, and eventually confessions from several German participants. In what became known as the Malmedy massacre trial, 74 former members of the Kampfgruppe were indicted at Dachau in May 1946. The trial revealed the complex circumstances surrounding the massacre. While no written order to kill prisoners was ever found, prosecutors demonstrated that SS units operated under an unwritten understanding that taking prisoners during a fast-moving advance was discouraged. Several lower-ranking defendants testified that they had been ordered not to burden themselves with prisoners, and that they understood this to mean that execution was permitted, if not explicitly ordered. Obersturmführer Werner Sternebeck, identified by survivors as the officer who fired the first shots, claimed during his testimony that the killings resulted from panic after several prisoners allegedly attempted to escape. It was not murder, he insisted. It was a battlefield incident that escalated out of control. Although subsequent investigations found no evidence of systematic misconduct by the prosecution, the controversy created enough doubt to affect the sentencing. By 1949, as Cold War tensions intensified and West Germany's strategic importance grew, the death sentences had been commuted to life imprisonment, then progressively reduced through a series of reviews and clemency decisions. The shifting geopolitical landscape played a crucial role in these decisions. As the Soviet Union consolidated its control over Eastern Europe and tensions with Western powers escalated, military and political leaders increasingly viewed West Germany as a necessary ally rather than a defeated enemy. This perspective influenced how war crimes cases were handled, with pragmatic diplomatic considerations sometimes outweighing the demands of justice. Joachim Peiper himself, after serving 11 years in prison, was released in December 1956, a decision that outraged survivors of the massacre and many American veterans. Upon his release, Peiper made no apologies for his wartime conduct, maintaining that he had acted as a soldier following orders and serving his country. He eventually settled in eastern France, where he worked as a translator and automobile sales manager under his own name, making no attempt to conceal his identity or past. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day in France, Peiper's house was attacked with Molotov cocktails by unknown assailants. His charred body was found in the ruins, though rumors persisted for years that he had staged his death and escaped to South America. While the perpetrators were never identified, local speculation centered on former French resistance members or relatives of civilians killed during Kampfgruppe Peiper's operations in 1944. The story of the Malmedy massacre did not end with the trials. For the survivors, the psychological impact lasted a lifetime. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and profound survivor's guilt for decades. The seemingly random nature of their survival, living because they happened to fall behind a particular body, or because an executioner overlooked them in the gathering dusk, created a form of existential burden that proved difficult to integrate into their post-war lives. Lieutenant Virgil Larry, who had led the first group to safety, devoted significant portions of his post-war life to ensuring the massacre remained in public memory, frequently speaking at veterans' gatherings and historical commemorations. "I survived by chance," Larry often said during these presentations. "I live because someone else's body shielded mine. That creates an obligation to speak for those who cannot." The Belgian community near Malmedy embraced this obligation as well. In 1945, they erected a stone memorial at the massacre site, which still stands today. Every December 17th, local citizens join with veterans and their families to commemorate the tragedy, laying wreaths and maintaining a solemn vigil regardless of weather conditions. The memorial bears a simple inscription in both French and English. Here, on December 17, 1944, 150 American prisoners of war were assembled in this field. 84 were murdered by German SS troops. The discrepancy in numbers reflects the initial uncertainty about exactly how many Americans were present and killed. Historical analysis of the Malmedy massacre continues to evolve as new documents become available and scholarly perspectives shift. Recent research has examined the massacre within the broader context of Wehrmacht and SS treatment of prisoners across all theaters of World War II. This work reveals that while the Malmedy incident stands as the worst atrocity against American prisoners on the Western Front, It fits a pattern of systematic brutality the Germans had practiced extensively on the Eastern Front. Military historian Robert Gerwart's studies of SS operations in Poland and Russia documented hundreds of instances where captured Soviet soldiers were executed rather than taken prisoner. Similarly, Sönke Neitzel's analysis of secretly recorded conversations among German POWs revealed casual discussions of prisoner killings, suggesting such practices were more normalized within certain units than previously understood. This context does not diminish the horror of Malmedy, but places it within a continuum of escalating brutality that characterized the war's final years. Perhaps most disturbingly, records indicate that the Malmedy massacre was not an isolated incident during the Ardennes offensive. Kampfgruppe Peiper committed similar, though smaller-scale atrocities against both American prisoners and Belgian civilians throughout their advance. In Stavelot, Lineville, La Glaise, and Stoumont, SS troops executed captured Americans and Belgian civilians suspected of aiding the Allied cause. These incidents followed a similar pattern, expedient killing rather than proper handling of prisoners, suggesting an operational approach rather than spontaneous violence. The massacre's legal legacy proved equally significant. The Malmedy trial established important precedents for prosecuting war crimes and clarified that following orders provides no absolute defense for actions that clearly violate international law and basic humanity. These principles would later influence the development of modern international humanitarian law. For many Americans, the Malmedy massacre represented a profound loss of innocence. Despite the brutal fighting in the Pacific Theater, many had maintained a view of the European war as relatively clean, fought between professional armies that generally respected established rules of combat. Malmedy shattered this perception, revealing that even on the Western Front, ideological fanaticism could transform warfare into calculated butchery. The massacre also complicated post-war reconciliation efforts. As West Germany became an important Cold War ally, tensions emerged between diplomatic necessity and justice for war crimes victims. The commutation of death sentences for convicted Malmedy perpetrators became a symbol of this uncomfortable compromise. Many American veterans organizations protested these decisions, arguing that political expediency was overriding moral accountability. These tensions would resurface repeatedly during the Cold War years as other Nazi war criminals received reduced sentences or early releases. Public memory of Malmedy evolved differently in America and Europe. In the United States, the massacre became emblematic of Nazi brutality, regularly featured in World War II histories and documentaries. In Europe, particularly Germany, it received comparatively less attention, often overshadowed by larger atrocities against civilian populations. This divergence reflects different national processes of coming to terms with the war's legacy. American narratives emphasizing the righteousness of their cause, German narratives focusing on broader questions of collective guilt and responsibility. The survivors who escaped that blood-soaked field carried more than just their physical and psychological wounds. They carried a responsibility to testify. Through their courage in coming forward, they ensured that what happened at a remote Belgian crossroads would not be forgotten or minimized. Their testimonies transformed the massacre from a buried battlefield atrocity into a documented war crime that demanded accountability. In his final public interview before his death in 2001, Virgil Larry reflected on the enduring significance of the massacre and its aftermath. What happened at Malmedy wasn't just about the 84 men who died there. It was about what happens when military forces abandon the most basic principles of humanity. When we surrender our humanity for tactical advantage, we lose something far more valuable than any battlefield objective. The snow at the Baugny crossroads melted in the spring of 1945, washing away the visible evidence of what had transpired there. The blood seeped into the soil. The shell casings were collected by investigators, and eventually grass grew again over the execution site. But the memory remained, preserved through survivor testimonies, historical records, judicial proceedings, and the quiet determination of those who believed such atrocities must never be forgotten. Today, visitors to the Baugny crossroads find a modern museum alongside the stone memorial. Inside are photographs, personal effects, and recorded testimonies that piece together the events of that December afternoon. The museum serves not merely as a memorial to the dead, but as a warning about the fragility of civilized conduct, even among supposedly advanced societies. The Malmedy massacre stands as a stark reminder that the line between organized warfare and murderous brutality remains terrifyingly thin. When ideology trumps humanity, when tactical expedience overrides moral principles, when men convince themselves that certain enemies deserve no mercy, the consequences echo far beyond the immediate battlefield. They extend across decades, leaving scars on survivors, perpetrators, and the collective conscience of nations. For the 84 Americans who died at Malmedy, most young men who had surrendered in good faith, expecting the protections guaranteed by international law, justice remains incomplete. The commutation of their killers' sentences, the relatively comfortable lives many perpetrators enjoyed after their release, and the gradual fading of public memory all represent a secondary betrayal. Yet through the persistence of survivors like Lieutenant Larry, through the Belgian community's faithful commemoration, through historical scholarship and education, their sacrifice continues to serve a purpose. It reminds us that civilization depends not on technology or military power, but on our collective willingness to recognize and protect human dignity, even in our darkest hours. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the survivors of Malmedy joined millions of other veterans returning to civilian life. They carried with them an intimate understanding of both human cruelty and human resilience. Many struggled to describe their experiences to families who could not possibly comprehend the horror of watching comrades executed in cold blood, or the terror of lying motionless among the dead while killers walked among them. How do you explain something like that? Kenneth Ahrens would later reflect. There are no words adequate to convey what it feels like to watch men you've lived with for months, trained with, joked with, shared packages from home with, to watch them murdered while standing with their hands up. It changes everything you thought you knew about humanity. Yet these men did find ways to speak about their experiences, recognizing that silence would only protect the perpetrators. Their testimonies ensured that the massacre would be recorded accurately in historical accounts of the Battle of the Bulge, rather than minimized as an unfortunate incident or explained away as battlefield confusion. In documenting the Malmedy massacre, we confront not just a historical atrocity, but a warning about what becomes possible when military forces abandon the constraints of law and morality. The men who died in that Belgian field 77 years ago continue to bear witness through their absence. Their story demands that we remain vigilant against the forces that would sacrifice humanity on the altar of expedience, ideology, or vengeance. For Lieutenant Virgil Larry and the other survivors who escaped that blood-soaked field, the journey back to safety through the frozen Ardennes was just the beginning of a longer journey, one that would require them to carry the truth of what they had witnessed through decades of peace, ensuring that the world would never forget the price paid when civilization's thin veneer cracks to reveal the darkness beneath.